this if Dr. Barinholtz hadn't already set everything up.
Oh, I heard you went to synagogue on Saturday and almost went twice. Sorry, I shouldn't laugh.
Okay, we're live again.
Sound check. Sound check, sound check. This is Perry. Can you hear me? Andrea, you ready?
Yes.
That's what she's going to do.
I'll leave it on.
Good. Thanks everyone for coming. Super appreciated. On behalf of Scott Goldstein, welcome to the Pikesville Training Space, 609. On behalf of the Medical Director's Office and Dr. Pollack, we certainly thank you for your dedication to lifelong learning. A big thanks to Ashley Brooks, who is now live streaming this on YouTube. It's available. We've had people in different states now tuning in, so that's really spectacular. So tonight we have Andrea Lavine. Andrea has a background in hospital social work with many years spent working with women and children's health. As a participant in the University of Maryland Hospital for Children's Child Protection Team, Andrea is keenly aware of the importance of the continuum of healthcare, beginning with the in-home observation of first responders. This was further enhanced when Andrea became a paramedic with Pikesville Volunteer Fire Company. And I also just want to acknowledge you. You have been scheduled. This is our third time scheduling you. You were snowed out. You were canceled because of my goof up in the schedule. So thanks for being so generous, for continuing to come back and to have the dedication to doing this.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. So this is a topic that I am very passionate about. Let me just get myself wired for sound here. When I first joined the fire company, I was already working as a hospital social worker and had not yet had my formal medical training where I was allowed to touch the patients. And one of the things, I've always wanted to be a paramedic, but one of the things that struck me working at university and working and going through the reports of the kids that would come in and the adults that would come in, one of the things that always struck me was I would look back at the EMS reports. I would look back at the information from the community physicians and any of the community programs. For those of you watching, that's a call. Just a minute. So one of the things that happened when we look back, and when I served on the child protection team, one of the things that happened is that you become aware that you are in an ivory tower when you're in the hospital. And in that ivory tower, you need folks on the street, and you need folks who are looking, seeing, smelling, recognizing what's going on. Well, fast forward to when I sat in the EMS classes, and they would say, yes, you're a mandatory reporter of abuse and neglect. Here's what abuse and neglect might look like. Tell a nurse. And I was sitting there as the social worker going, yeah, that's not how it works. That is not how it works. And that's not what we need as responders as far as training. And that's not what our kids, adults, and any vulnerable population needs in the community. So here's what happens. You think you've seen somebody who might be abused, and you go, ooh, that doesn't look right. But maybe I'm wrong, and I shouldn't say something. We've had people come to Dr. Barinholtz and I, and many other people have had folks come and say to us, what do I do? It didn't look right. It didn't, well, it didn't sound right. It didn't feel right when I got there. Well, what did you do about it? I told a nurse, or I clicked a box in my report. Well, now that we're not handwriting reports anymore, we're missing a lot in the narrative at the social services point. And when all we do is train folks, it doesn't look right, tell a nurse, we're actually not doing what we need to do. So we put this training together. I actually put this training together initially when I was becoming an instructor with MIFRE, and once I put that training together and I started getting all of the information, more and more folks started asking me questions. So, hence the program. So many first responders are afraid. We're afraid to make a report, we're afraid of what we see, we're afraid of what we hear. But how many of us, if we saw a dog being kicked or an animal who was being abused, we'd be like, oh, that poor animal, it doesn't have anybody to speak for it. Well, neither do our vulnerable adults, and neither do our vulnerable children, and we need to be that voice for them. As I go through the slides, I'm going to presume you can read them on your own. So I'm going to do more talking about them and let do what we said we were going to do, and then we tell you what we did. Here's your objectives. Okay, what is abuse? This is participatory. So I really want to hear what you guys think of as abuse.
What forms of verbal abuse?
Sure.
Berating,
Sure.
and bullying is really abuse.
Absolutely. So bullying is abusive, whether it's verbal, whether it is emotional, and whether it is physical. Who can be the bully?
Anybody, unfortunately, everybody, anybody.
Sure. And bullying brings about a certain difference from abuse itself in the strictest form, because in order to be abused in the strictest form, you have to be vulnerable. Well, find me somebody who's not vulnerable. Find me someone who doesn't feel. We all like to say, especially in the bravado in the fire service and in the first responders, we like to say, oh yeah, that doesn't affect me. You should see what I see on a daily basis. Yeah, tell that to the statistics that show burnout and show suicide and show aggression and show us being the bulliers. It does affect us. So everybody is vulnerable. So yes, bullying is a form of abuse. What about the vulnerable adults, children, and what we now call intimate partner abuse? Intimate partner abuse is what we used to call domestic violence. However, you know, domestic violence doesn't catch everybody, because not everybody who's intimate lives together. Not everybody is a couple. Some people are just very close to one another, and it can lead to the bullying. So who can be abused as a vulnerable? What does a vulnerable adult look like? What is a pediatric, a vulnerable child? How old are they?
By our protocol classification, like 15 and under, or 8?
So I promise all of you, I did not plant Ricky. I did not plant Randy in the audience. I know.
That's okay.
I did not plant Randy in the audience. But you're 100% right. Children, in our protocol, we treat them one way. And in the law, they're another way. 0 to 18. But it doesn't mean that once you hit 18, you can't be abused. If you're vulnerable, if you have an intellectual deficit, if you have a social deficit, if you have a psychiatric deficit, if you have functional issues that make you not chronologically and developmentally on par, just because you're 18 doesn't mean you're an adult. So when we are out in public, I'm going to put a scenario out there for you. Because this never happens here, right? We're never called to a playground where a nanny who may not speak English is in charge of this child who can't talk to you because they're 2.5 or under 2, right? They fall from a slide. Okay, we now have a fall of more than 2 or 3 times their height. they're crying and they can't tell you what's going on, and their caregiver doesn't speak your language and may or may not be documented, so might be afraid of us showing up in our uniform. And so what do you have to do? We're all providers. What do you do if someone falls from more than twice their height and they can't tell you where the ouchie is? What else do we do? We expose them. We gotta look. We have to see their skin. Well, you expose their skin and you see multiple round circles on their thighs. What do you think when you see round circles on their thigh?
Well, is that like cigarette burn circles, or is that like the circles that some of these cultures do? Yeah, I mean, we've seen that too.
Very good. So what would the difference between a cigarette burn look like, and what would the difference between a cupping?
A cigarette burn would be a raw, I mean, just that small.
It looks like a burn.
Yeah.
The skin is raw, it might be raised, it might be in multiple stages of healing. It doesn't look like a bruise, it looks like a burn. So you've exposed a child and now you saw burns or bruises that are not consistent with forward motion. What do you do? Well, who are you calling the police on? They can't tell you who the kid is, they can't tell you what the kid's name is.
You're trying to get a translator app thing on it, and
Right.
try to communicate with the nanny.
So you've outlined exactly that we have an obligation to do something, and turning our head isn't one of them. Turning away isn't one of them. So an abuser could be the person who's responsible for providing guidance, safety, feeding, clothing, nurturing, and care and attention, okay? Caring for the child's welfare. Now what about vulnerable adults?
Same thing, and something intellectually old, dementia, I mean, all of this.
So who could be the abuser for them?
Anybody, their children, their family, a caregiver who's neglecting, I mean.
Most of their trusted individuals, right? So I have a large circle of friends, colleagues, and one of my friends, and there's video cameras everywhere today, including on our hips and in our houses, and you're not allowed to video with a nanny cam unless somebody knows that they're being videoed. Parents, and one of whom is now nonverbal with Alzheimer's. The caregivers, they have round-the-clock caregivers. The caregivers know they're on video. They found the caregiver yanking and pulling his mom's hair. Not just like, I'm brushing your hair and it hurts. Trust me, I have a kid with really curly hair. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about actually, instead of saying to somebody, put your head up, because of fear of not finding caregivers for his parents, the person was fired and paid to go away, but no police report was filed. Abuse or neglect.
Neglect is just net, abuse is intentional.
So there's acts of omission or acts of commission. Something you did or something you didn't do. Neglect can look like many different things. I'm going to give you another example from my practice. You have a child who is a diabetic. Okay, so if a child is a type 1 diabetic, do they make any insulin? No. Can they take care of their own food needs and acquire their own food? No. So they're going to eat what's put in front of them. This is an example from a Baltimore City resident, although it could happen anywhere. This kid comes into the hospital with blood sugars through the roof and in DKA. So one of the things we look to keep them alive long enough in early childhood and in the younger years, it's to teach their parents to keep them alive, and as adolescents will be adolescents, it's keep them alive until they're interested in keeping themselves alive. Keep them alive long enough that they can take responsibility for their own care and actually want to be grown-ups and live. So we get a report, an EMS report, that somebody was smart enough to look at their medications, to look in the fridge and to look in the cabinets. What do you found? Can't hear you, Harvey.
No insulin.
Oh, they found the insulin.
A lot.
Pretty much. What else did they find as far as nutrition? Junk food, carbs, candy bars. They must have been really good friends with my pediatric allergy patient who was allergic to shellfish, who, thank goodness, maybe they had the same medics, I don't know. But my pediatric allergy patient who was allergic to shellfish, to peanuts, to a whole host of things, who they arrive on scene for anaphylaxis and look at the foods that the family is feeding them. And the family is using their WIC card to go buy food at Lexington Market or wherever they can get cheap food. And they're picking the shrimp out of the shrimp fried rice and feeding the child the shrimp fried rice. So those of us who understand anaphylaxis are not surprised that this child anaphylaxed, whether it was the peanut oil that the shrimp fried rice was made with, whether it was the shellfish, or whether it was the soy sauce that was poured all over it. We're not sure. But had the documentation not been there from EMS when they were in the household, we would have had very little knowledge of whether or not it was just an education thing, was it just a socioeconomic issue, what was it? Was it abuse? Were they actively doing something, or was it neglect? Because it was an act of omission. So, the vulnerable adults who can be neglected, have any of us ever gone to grab a adult from either their home, where they probably weren't fully independent even though they're living alone, or gone even to an assisted living facility, or to a nursing home, and we smelled our patient a mile away? Or we get there and we're going up to a house that's literally, if it was in good condition, would be a really, really expensive house. And we walk in and they're living in squalor. Abuse or neglect. Intimate partner neglect. That can also be omission. We all have certain needs that are basic to life, and we shouldn't have to ask if we need to go to the bathroom. We shouldn't have to ask if we need to buy extra pairs of underwear. We shouldn't need to ask anybody else if we need to have a friend to reach out to, but we're not sure we're allowed to use our phone, because if we do, we could have a hammer in our head. So let's just define things for a minute. We talked about children. Children are ages 0 to 18. Adults are above 18. Even if you are a 18 to 21-year-old who is functionally at the infantile level, or even at a low elementary school level, you are still considered an adult. The caregiver is the individual who has permanent or temporary care, custody, or responsibility for that adult or child. The caregiver can include, but not limited to, the step-parent, foster parent, guardian. We go for guardianship for adults in the hospital. If they're vulnerable adults and no one is willing to step up, we move for guardianship, and Adult Protective Services has guardianship. A guardian who's been appointed by the court can unfortunately still be abusive or neglectful. Any facility or program that's caring for a child, this is where sex trafficking comes in, right? Somebody has either become the caregiver for a child because somebody turned them over to them, or has abducted a child, or has promised, freedom in the US as long as they do what they're told. That all can fall under abuse and neglect. So we're going to get into a few things about COMAR, which is the Code of Maryland Annotated Regulation. And you have those in your handouts because COMAR is what gives us the legal rights and responsibility for reporting. It also gives us our definitions, and there are 2 separate COMARs. COMAR is codified by, and the title here is under Health and Human Services, under Chapter 7, and I'll go into there for a second in a minute. We talked about omission and commission. Now, we've talked about physical injury a lot. We've talked a little bit about emotional injury. We've talked about sex trafficking. We haven't talked about the inappropriate touching or sexual exploitation or making unwanted advances towards children or adults. So, photography, pornography, and being found with any of those on your computer or on your person are also fall under the abuse and neglect. Now, a child, what are some signs that you might see that a child might be experiencing neglect? Other than what is readable up here. Malnourishment.
Inappropriate dress for the season.
Being inappropriately dressed for the season. Well,
Dirty.
say it again.
Dirty, unkempt.
Dirty and unkempt. How about inappropriately friendly towards you? You walk in and you're a total stranger and a 5-year-old just will bring you a book, sit down on your lap, or start making eye contact and talking with you and give you hugs. You might think that that's just a child who is just really friendly, but that should raise your index of suspicion. When someone who is typically age or developmentally appropriate for fear instead shows acceptance and craving attention, look at that and think critically, are they just a super friendly person or child? Or is there something else that might be going on here? Because the person that they're trusting is a person who would naturally have an index of distrust in that age and stage. What about untreated illnesses, untreated injuries, old fractures that aren't healed properly? Say it again. Oh, okay, sorry. What about, again, I'm not trying to bring about vicarious trauma to anybody or trigger anybody who's watching, this is my trigger alert statement. What about children or elderly who present with a sexually transmitted? I have to look far. It was in the news recently. Vegetative state, started delivering a baby. It was in the news. I had a case of a 90-something-year-old grandma who came in to the ER and tested positive for an STD. We went through her medical record, combed through it before contacting Adult Protective Services to make sure there was no past history and this wasn't just a flare-up. And she wasn't like, the granny who's out there. I mean, I'm a grandmother, but she wasn't the granny who's out there at the clubbing and partying. This is a debilitated woman who was requiring the care of others who presented with chlamydia and gonorrhea. How about somebody who's over-sexualized? How about a child who behaves in a way, now it's kind of hard to tell in today's age because teenagers are getting younger and younger, but what about a child who presents with overtly sexualized behaviors?
They may be acting on something that they've seen or have been forced to perform.
Correct. In case you didn't hear, they may be acting on something that they have seen or been forced to perform. Again, we don't have to know who or where or when something happened. We're looking at raising our index of suspicion. What about signs of a mental injury or illness? Somebody who's withdrawn, somebody who has extremes in behavior, extremely clairvoyant, extremely outgoing, or extremely shy, regardless of what you do. We have upcoming an opportunity through national. Maryland has passed a law. Baltimore City has enacted it in a grant-funded role. Yosef, what's it called? Mobile Integrated Healthcare. We are not just the first responders, but we are the eyes on the street. Mobile Integrated Healthcare. What happens if you see somebody over and over and over again and you notice a change in their skills? And we're not talking about a positive change. Certain people losing of skills that were otherwise present. Should be suspicious. Okay, the maltreatment of a vulnerable adult. They might be very easily mistaken for other injuries or illnesses. What kind of medical conditions do we have that we see confusion, anger, depression, or shame, for example, that we might just chalk something up to not abuse or neglect, but we might think it's the condition. There's nothing wrong with this person's environment. It's just a manifestation of what kind of illness? Say it again. Dementia. Alzheimer's. Someone, Parkinson's, I heard someone say.
I was going to say, my dad, Parkinson's
Right?
yeah.
What about substance use? Right? Some of these can present, right? Financial, right? Maybe they're looking like you expect one thing because of where they live, or how what they're driving, or how they speak to you with a certain level of intellect. But you get there, or you look at what their clothing that they're wearing and it's got holes in it and it's clearly not laundered, right? Or they say, I can't afford to eat. I can't afford my medicines, which may not be neglect. That's just, unfortunately, a topic for another time about how hard it is to afford the medications. How about isolation? Social isolation. Not everybody is an extrovert. Not everybody who's an introvert is being abused. But if you're interviewing someone and their significant other, whether it's their caregiver, whether it's the person who has responsibility for them, their guardian, if you're talking to them, right, and you're making eye contact with them and you're doing a full body assessment or your doorway assessment when you walk in, and they start looking at the other person as they're answering your questions or as they're asking the questions, somebody who can answer for themselves should be allowed to answer for themselves, and that's a really important sign that maybe something else is going on. You have this as a handout, not that. Let's see if it does what it's supposed to. Nope. This is the DHS document to be on the lookout for abuse of the elderly and vulnerable adults. I apologize that didn't click up on the screen the way it was supposed to. Probably user error. However, if you look at this document, there's a lot of good information on it that through the time frame, the age range, and the abilities are relevant. This is put out by the Department of Human Resources from the state of Maryland, and it tells you really what to look for and a number to call. Is everybody good, or do we need a break? This is some heavy stuff. Okay. So let's talk about reporting. right? We said, I am a newly minted EMT and I saw something that I heard on Andrea's lecture and it didn't look right, so I'm going to tell the charge nurse at the hospital. Does that do it? Have you just relieved yourself of any responsibility you may have? No, you haven't. And not only that, you've told something to the nurse that now she has an obligation to do something about, or he has an obligation to do something about, and in all fairness to them, when you're lined up in the hallway, 10 medics deep, that may not make it in the differential. Now, e-meds, right? Woohoo, we can electronically chart. How many of you have gone to a doctor and had them not make eye contact with you because they're busy clicking, 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 click, 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 send? How many of you have read a medical record lately that's been generated that way? Dr. Barinholtz, if I could pick on you for a second?
Yes.
What has happened with all the click boxes that we have now to narratives throughout medical practices, not just in EMS?
Every record you talk about everything is longer than it used to. Hospitals,
So your medical records are becoming longer with everything documented, including the non-pertinent negatives. And are you finding that more people are taking the time after they've clicked through a bazillion screens to write their narrative, or are they kind of like, well, I got all that in the click boxes and I have to hit the street again?
pretty much fed up.
People are fed up. So what's happening? When I used to open a patient medical record and I would look at it, 1 second, I won't be heard. So when I would open a medical record in the past, I would go past all of our hospital approved forms and go to the ones that were photocopied in the back. And I would look at the narrative and I would look for what did I see, what did I hear, what did I experience, and what did I find? And I served on the child protection team. And that was so important. And when I worked in shock trauma as a social worker, again, so important. We always tell our EMS providers, describe your scene. Tell us what you saw when you got there, because that will give us our clinical idea of what the injury might be, if it's a mechanism of injury, if it's a nature of illness, what did you see? How bad did they smell? Were there scars and their wounds oozing? You know, did they feel hot? Now we get through all of these things and we finish clicking our medical records and nobody's writing a narrative, not even a SOAP note. Or the narrative that they're writing is so not in the forefront of their mind that the details are getting left out. And this is where we come in. The details are everything. So what do you got to do? Now you've increased your index of suspicion. You know there's a problem. Or you know maybe there's a problem, but you're afraid to say something, so you're just going to tell the nurse. Or, well, there was a cop on the scene too. You know, we needed forced entry, so they must have known. They saw it too, so I'm absolved of my obligation, right? Since the topic is reporting of abuse and neglect, you can probably be certain that the answer is no, you're not absolved of your obligation. So, mandatory reporting. Who is a mandatory reporter? Let's see if you know. Come on. People who are licensed by what? Okay. People who are licensed in the state I have a driver's license, am I a mandatory reporter? And I'm not making fun of you.
To provide care.
To provide care. Who else?
Safety.
Public safety officers. Who else? Someone that people encounter every day, especially children. Teachers. Healthcare providers. teachers, clergy, say it again, police. Mandatory reporters for abuse and neglect. If everybody who was obligated was actually making a report, we would be overwhelmed with reports and we might have fewer dead children and dead adults. In Maryland, every single citizen is reporter. The difference is shall report, right? Can you or should you? Must you or should you? So the way that the COMAR is written is that every single person walking in Maryland should. So everybody's a mandatory reporter under that classification. But then we have a mandated reporter. So I'm going to say it again because I have to ask this next question. A health practitioner. Are EMTs a health practitioner? I was hoping for a more resounding answer. Are EMTs a health practitioner? Yes. Are first responders who carry an EMR card a health practitioner? Yes. Are firefighters a health practitioner? If they're an EMT. What if, because now Maryland may or may not require it in the future. What if you don't carry any kind of card other than a CPR card? Are you a mandatory reporter? We get into the should or shall. Okay? Human service workers. Human services workers are folks who come into contact with people in need, whether they're volunteering, right? You're volunteering at a shelter, you're volunteering at any health and human services type of location. Police officers. Now, you do not, I'm going to say this in big bold letters if I could, the balloon would say you do not have to have proof and you do not have to be certain that abuse is occurring. They need to be at risk for or you are concerned for their welfare. So, I'm going to read it straight out of the COMAR because I didn't write this part and I don't want to make a mistake. Individuals, this is reporting of child abuse and neglect. COMAR 7.02.07.04. Reporting of child abuse or neglect. Individuals who are not mandated reporters and have reason to believe that a child has been abused or neglected shall immediately notify a local law enforcement agency or a local department by any available means. A mandated reporter, that's us, shall report suspected child abuse or neglect that occurred in Maryland. 1, by oral report, mandatory reporting, immediately after the contact or event that revealed the suspected child abuse or neglect to the local department or law enforcement agency, doesn't say charge nurse, in the jurisdiction where the suspected abuse or neglect occurred. And by written report within 48 hours of the contact or event that revealed the suspected abuse or neglect to the local department and the state's attorney office in the jurisdiction. Now, the good news is you fill out a DHR 180, which is a CPS reporting form, or you call it in, and all those numbers are included in here, and they'll take care of alerting the state's attorney's office. You don't have to do that. But you do have to make a verbal report immediately with a written report followed up in 48 hours. Now, effective October 1st, 2016, if a local department does an investigation and has reason to believe that a mandated reporter, that's us folks, knowingly did not report the abuse or neglect or suspected abuse and neglect, they must, not just can they must file a complaint with the appropriate licensing board. So for everybody who was afraid before 2016 that if they reported they'd get in trouble, if you don't report, you could lose your license, which means you could lose your livelihood, or even worse, you could face charges.
We have a question online.
Yes.
Does this mandate involve fellow practitioners when they see abuse while not actively practicing?
Okay, so the question was, and I have a note taker, does this law follow abuse or neglect observations when you are not functioning as a practitioner? Let me ask you this. Is there ever a time with all the knowledge that you have in your brain that you turn that off? Do you ever not notice that nasty cough that sounds like maybe they're going to go into flash pulmonary edema? Is there ever a time where you see somebody with a bruise on their jaw that's so big and fresh that you're not wondering what happened right after you saw their parent or guardian or the adult yank them? So that when you are not functioning in your versus when you're in your professional role, you shall. Nobody's going to hunt you down on the videotape at the Giant or at your local 7-Eleven and say, there, that person saw it happen. What license do they hold? I'm going after them. However, if you are in one of those other 4 mandated reporter areas and you're functioning as such, you must report. If they tell you whether or not I answered their question fully, I would appreciate it. Anybody, this is the part where people don't realize. Anybody who makes a report in good faith that they are concerned and have suspicion or a reason to be concerned that somebody is at risk for harm, abuse, or neglect has immunity from civil liability and criminal penalty. So that's important. You know, we all, in the volunteer world, right, we all get a little squirrely and we see an accident and we're like, hey, is everybody okay? Versus some of us roll up our windows and go, if I didn't see it, it didn't happen, I'm going to keep driving, right? Because we don't want to do something wrong. So here with abuse and neglect, if you don't report it and you saw it, you're wrong. If you do report it and you had reason to think that maybe it was something that gave you a little bit of an index of suspicion that they're at risk, and you report it, you've done the right thing. Okay? You have a handout. Let's see if it does it on the screen. You don't have the handout. It's literally exactly what I read you. Okay? And it is the specifics from the Maryland Department of Human Services Child Protective Services website, dhr.maryland.gov, as you see here. And it specifies exactly what I've been saying, that you do not have to have proof, and that your reports have to be made as soon as you become aware. Waiting for proof may involve grave risk for the child. if you saw a dog running around and running in and out of traffic, you would probably try and take them into your car and scan them and see if they have a microchip and return them to their owner because something bad might happen to them. Don't act any less responsibly for children. Yes, Doc?
So what is this, so when we make this, we call this number 1-800-91-PREVENT, what's that conversation likely going to be like, and what are they going to do?
Funny you should ask. So, what agency do we report to? What kind of information are they going to ask us? What do we need to include? Okay? You're going to be asked, now if you're at the Giant or 7-Eleven or you're that person who should but doesn't have to report, you can make an anonymous report. Let me say this. I said this as a practicing social worker. I stand by it as a paramedic, and I stand by it as somebody who goes out of my comfort zone all the time into the community. Not reporting is easy. Reporting is hard. The day that I become comfortable with the idea that I'm interfering with somebody else's private life and what they may or may not know as their norm is probably the day I should stop practicing both. Because your mom is your mom whether she beats you or not. Your trusted caregiver is the one who makes sure that whichever of your medications they actually give you, you get. Whatever you have is better than what you don't have, and the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. So people are afraid to come forward and report what's happening to them. We should be more afraid not to make a report than to make a report, because we shouldn't be comfortable with it. We are messing with somebody's normal. But that's what we signed up for. And that's what we need to do as humans. Okay? Oh, look at that. My apologies. Look how far we've come. Okay. You're going to need a little bit of information. Most of it we have. You're going to need to know who you're reporting, where they live, where it occurred, who is responsible, and you need to describe what occurred. Okay? When they ask about the name of the victim, you're going to need their name, their address, their date of birth, if you have it. If you don't have it, you can tell them what hospital you took them to, because I guarantee they have all that information. Because it's part of the insurance, and it's part of how they get paid. And all you have to do is give them the dots, and they will connect them. Regarding mental health injury, when you are describing the bullying, you need to give a description of the substantial impairment of the person for whom you're concerned. If it's a child, if it's an adult, what is their inability to function, or what is their functional level, and why you believe that what has occurred is either an act of omission or commission. We're not supposed to know it all. We're not social workers, most of us. We're not human services workers. We're not supposed to know it all. So here's a few of the things that you can know and carry with you. I mean, we all carry more of a computer in our pocket now than most of us had access to in college. 211 Maryland. 211 Maryland is started out as being funded by the United Way of Central Maryland. It was only open to those of us who were in the health and human services field. Not all their information is correct, but it's close, okay? 211 Maryland, guess how you dial 211 Maryland? You pick up your phone and you dial 211. Their website is 211maryland.org. Their goal is to provide the information. You don't have to even have the full understanding of what you're trying to describe. You just have to know you have a problem, and they will help you figure out who to call. So we tell the kids when we do the birthday parties, if you have an emergency, press 911, our source for everything that is Health and Human Services related. COMAR, you can always back yourself up knowing what the laws are. The Department of Health and Human Services website and your local Department of Social Services, which is very easy to find, really very easy. All you do is type in the jurisdiction. In front of you, you have, I separated them out. You have a cheat sheet that is this slide. Okay? The age, what you think is happening, who's responsible, what's reportable, who reports it, how to report it, and where to report it. Okay? If I had given this to you at the beginning, you might not have sat through this, so we kept it. Remember, proof is not necessary. Oral report has to be made when? When do you have to follow it up with a written report? Within 48 hours, and who's going to tell you where to get the form? The person taking the report. It is called a 180 form, but that doesn't matter. They will either fax it to you, email it to you, or tell you where to find it on the web. Here's the frustrating thing. Not every time you call will they accept the report. You can call and you can say, I have a situation. They will take your name, your title, your information, they will listen to all of it. And they will keep that information because future information may come up to which that's relevant, but there may not be enough for them to open a case. So they will take the information, but they may not open a protective services case, or they may not go out and see the family. In that case, you have fulfilled your obligation. You have called it in. They will tell you if you need to follow it up with a written report. I would do that anyway, even if they're not going to accept it. And the bottom line of the report, so if you don't have it in front of you, you won't know this, so this is something to write down. Take the name and phone number of the person to whom you made the report and note the time and the date. If you put that in your, if you put very little else in your eMeds, make sure you put that in it. Because I'll tell you, I had a patient, I'm sorry, Rozzy, you're going to hear this again. I had a patient who had been removed from his family's home. He was in foster care. The way that, in the Clinton era, the way that foster care and protective services works is that the goal is always reunification until it's not. So we try to reunify children with their natural parents. This child was reunified with his natural parent. She did everything she needed to do, and in this case it was mom. Unfortunately, within 2 months of being reunified, after 4 years in foster care, he was brought into the hospital with severe burns from the bathtub. He's a child who was old enough to fight and scream and claw his way. And yet, he was placed into water and held, again, this is because of my role on the child protection team that we had to figure this out. In order to be scalded and burned to the degree he was in the bath water, he had to physically be held down. That's horrible. And there was a lot of work that went on with the providers who both found him, the providers who provided care to him in the emergency room and in the ICU, and with the social workers who were only following the rules when they reunified him with his mom. Unfortunately, he died. Because of the report and the details that the first responders made. He, A, got 4 more years than he would have gotten, and B, it was very clear when he came in with the burns, everything was documented, and we knew who needed to be held accountable for it. This is more about what happens. The difference between this slide and the last slide was this details sexual abuse. Okay, this goes on to neglect and the differences, and you have your citations. Again, immediately make the report. Even if they don't take it, even if they don't open a claim, even if they don't open the information. So here's a little background, little to the side. HIPAA, everybody says HIPAA this, HIPAA that. I can't this, I can't that. HIPAA and confidentiality are not the same thing. Confidentiality between providers who are continuously providing care along a continuum, not continuously as in I've been following this patient for the last 15 years. As long as you're within the continuum of care, you can seek information from other providers. Understandably, not everybody is comfortable with that when you pick up a phone and you call. So we used to be able to pick up the phone and call and say, who's the social, can I'd like to speak to the social worker for so-and-so, or is there an open case for so-and-so? Along came HIPAA, and along came more stringent confidentiality rules, and you stopped. Social services won't tell you if there's an open case or not. Not that this is important for you guys to know how to work around that, but by documenting in your notes and passing along the information that you made a report, somebody like me can come along behind and pick up the phone and call and say, not is there an open case, but can I speak to the worker for so-and-so? I'm not asking you. I'm assuming there's an open case. It's kind of like saying to a patient who is clearly intoxicated, not did you drink today? What did you drink today? Which recreational drugs are you involved with? It's about asking the question in a way you can get the answer. Vulnerable adults. This is the same summary for vulnerable adults. Remember I said I was going to tell you what I was going to do, I was going to do it, and then I was going to tell you what I did? That's this slide. Remember, age doesn't matter. Size doesn't matter. You can have very robust, strong individuals. They can be the subject of intimate partner abuse. They can be a vulnerable adult because there's somebody who's taking care of their medications because they can't manage them themselves. You don't always know who can't read. You don't always know who can't write. And you don't always know who's managing somebody else's care. But if something doesn't seem right, do something about it, please. We can't, as paramedics and as first responders and as EMTs, walk into somebody's house and say, are you literate? Or is somebody else reading all your medication labels for you? As we get into this integrated health profile, I will share with you that one of the things that we did in the complex and chronic care clinic for folks who were not adept at reading complicated names of medications, we color-coded them with either electrical tape or Sharpies and wrote their dosages in the same tape, in the same color. We also took syringes that, because pediatric, often a lot of our cardiac kids were getting their medication in like tiny, tiny syringes, like insulin syringes, and using it as an oral syringe. And we color-coded those so that they matched the bottle that the medication was coming from. Remember that very often there are folks who appear strong and capable, and kids who appear as though there shouldn't be a problem, but you're looking for the subtle hints. It doesn't, abuse and neglect don't discriminate on age, socioeconomic level, education. It is a different type of cancer, but it is a cancer nonetheless. And we are the ones who can do something about it. Because this course was initiated by request from folks who didn't have access to this information, I'm really open to any questions, any information. I know I threw a lot at you, which is why I gave you all the resources that I quoted in here, the COMAR as well. So questions, comments, concerns, ideas, please.
If a healthcare provider, or those of us mandated, felt we had just cause to call, make a report, why would the person on the other end not necessarily feel they needed to do anything about it?
That's a great question. So often, we become incredulous or very alarmed by circumstances that unfortunately, based on the way we present it to the person screening, might not fit their criteria for abuse and neglect. That being said, if you are motivated to call, write yourself a script of exactly what it is you want to say, and make sure that you present it with the same level of alarm that you felt when you saw it. If you're calling at the end of your shift, right, and you've been chasing your tail for 10 hours, and there's something you saw earlier that day, and you call and you're like, yeah, so the kid, they fell off the slide. I don't remember exactly what it was that I saw, but they were round and they could have been cigarette marks, but she was with the nanny, so don't know. That case is going to get marked as, hey, you called, and hey, we took the information, so if that name gets flagged again, we'll know, but it's not gonna, nothing's going to happen. So be sure, a lot of it is how you say it. Maya Angelou, one of my favorite quotes is, right? People will not remember what you say or do, but will always remember how you make them feel. So if you make them feel the alarm that you felt when you saw it, they're not medical people. They won't know the severity of the fact that there was only junk food in the house. Hey, they spoiled that kid rotten, that's great. Yeah, so they gave him takeout and he's allergic to everything they fed him and it almost made his heart stop and, you know, that would be bad. They don't know that. Or, hey, they fed him junk food and he's got diabetes. Aw, they just fed, he's got the sugar, they fed his sweet tooth. That's so sweet. I'm sure they gave him enough insulin afterward, you know. We need to share the level of alarm that we see using words that they can understand and terms they can understand. Yes? You're welcome.
The question is, if the police are there on the same call, is it considered reporting if you tell the police what you saw, or do you still need to report it to CPS?
That is a phenomenal question. If you take the badge number of the person you speak to, and you say to that officer, and you have a dialogue with them, document it. If you know, we have this concept in medicine of when we take an order from a physician, it's called verbal order readback. You know, you want to make sure that you got the information correctly when we consult on a doc on the box and we say, you want me to give what medication? And we say, they repeat it and we repeat it back in a dose and we document it. You've had that conversation on the fire ground. We want to have face-to-face communications when there's a major incident going on. So If you have face-to-face communication with an officer on location and the officer, and you say to the officer, this is my official report, do you need me to do anything further? You've covered yourself. The officer might say, I only came after you. I didn't see what you saw. Your report would be helpful. When we talk about whether or not they're going to take a call or they're going to take a call because they're paid to answer the phone and screen. But whether or not they're going to open a file and open a report, how much more weight is given to the situation that they may not understand if they get a call from EMS and police? What is the harm in having 2 calls? Joe.
Andrea, you say that you're supposed to document this contact with the police. I would think that this would be a prominent standout in the narrative that you spoke to the police officer, their name, their badge number, and a brief description, high points, bullet points, that you told him directly.
Hopefully in your narrative, you've already said the alarming things. I was alarmed by, my index of suspicion was raised by, here are the actions that I took. Information was, officer so-and-so conferred with officer so-and-so and verified that they will make all notifications from here. Badge number, name number. Now this is not, I am not giving you legal advice. I am giving you the accepted, you have made the notification. Due diligence. If you didn't document it, it didn't happen.
Then would it not be the officers need to go hunt down this report from our records and not ours to present it to them?
We have to provide the dots. They have to connect them. When I say they, I mean the protective services agencies. We need to leave the breadcrumbs. They need to gather them. We have called them, or we have spoken to the officer. What is the officer going to do with that information? The officer is going to call protective services. So it would be prudent to make the call yourself, because the officer, protective services of adult and children is not a police matter. They unfortunately get involved because they have to, but it is not a police matter. It goes to the local Department of Social Services. We have gotten in the habit of passing the buck. So what do I want your take home to be? Sure, you want to tell a police officer instead and document that you told them who you told and when you told them and what their badge number is and all that information? Absolutely. The prudent thing is there's never too many calls to social services when you're really concerned.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any more questions? Comments?
I just want to mention, use caution when you're speaking to the child.
Thank you.
Who is possibly been physically or sexually abused, because these children are very eager to please, and they will, if you ask the question in the wrong way, you will get a different answer.
So
if we're called in for a case, for a sexual assault case, we never question the children. They have forensic interviewers that do the questioning.
for those of you watching online, the nurse who's speaking is a forensic safer nurse and able to called for sexual assault and rape cases. And thank you, that was very important. We are not forensic interviewers, we are not forensic experts. We are the eyes and the ears. You don't have to ask the questions, did somebody hurt you? Or you don't have to ask all the questions. If you see something, and it sounds so cliche now because we hear it everywhere, see something, say something, okay? We're not to do those interviews, like Rozzy said. Doc?
I feel like a lot of times now at triage, the nursing staff and EDs are asking some screening questions about, are you safe?
Yeah, so have you received,
How is that different than what us ask?
They're absolving themselves of responsibility. Those open-ended questions that they're looking at the computer as they're checking the box and not making eye contact with you, they're checking a box they have to check off in order to get paid for that visit. Because JCO, or Joint Commission, has decided that we should screen 100% of folks coming into the ER for safety at home, because we can reduce readmission rates by making sure that people are safe. Checking a box is not the same as having a conversation. We can and should ask, do you feel safe? Which is different than saying, so who's abusing you? Because you plant the seed and somebody wants to please, as Razi said, somebody wants to please, so they're gonna tell you something.
So what may be some good questions?
Open-ended questions. What happened? Who takes care of you? Who bathes you? How often? What have you had to eat today? When's the last time you took a bath? Who manages your medicines? Do you know what they are? These are some of the questions. Has there been any change in who's taking care of you recently? Remember, not
Same types of questions for kids, obviously things that are appropriate for the age, but
age appropriate.
types of questions.
Sure.
Where you-
Who do you go to when you're scared? Because you know what? The same person who takes care of them, when you say, who takes care of you? My mom, my dad, my aunt, my big brother. That's not going to tell you, that might tell you who the responsible party is. That may not tell you you can't jump to say who the abuser is. And I'm not saying that we should hang anybody out to dry or we should formulate opinions about people, nor should we act on those opinions when we're interacting with folks. But if you have an index of suspicion that something's not right, you got to say something. Now, that being said, if you get to a scene, and I know you cover this in continuing education classes and they cover this in initial education classes, you get to a scene and you have to do something right then. Don't pick up the radio in front of the person who you think is abusing. 325 to dispatch, I got a case of domestic abuse or child abuse. Don't do it in front of them. Leave your partner with the situation, step out, switch to a different channel if you need to, because their radio is going to pick up everything you say. Request an EMS supervisor if necessary. Request the police. Keep yourself safe. But request that other level of intervention if you need.
And there was a statement that says observe body language when asking questions.
Absolutely.
Body language that we should be looking for.
Observe body language. So we said on one thing we mentioned is that if you're asking a question and the person, you're making eye contact with the person and you've been having this conversation with them, and then they start asking or looking with their eyes towards somebody else in the room as they're asking the questions, almost like pleading, like, is it okay? Am I allowed to say this? That's a body language. That would be a body language to look for. Look for withdrawal from physical touch. We are supposed to ask before we touch any of our patients. Even if you ask, if you reach out to touch them and they jump away, or there's flinching where there shouldn't be, look at that. It goes without saying, because I believe you've all had the training, the initial training, but just in case you haven't, looking for wounds in multiple stages of healing, bruises in multiple stages of healing, injuries that aren't consistent with the story. On children, you are going to see lots of bruises on their shins and elbows and hands, injuries of forward motion, bumps on their heads. The good news is about kids is they're close to the ground. So when they go boom, they might get a bruise, but they're close to the ground. But if there's a lot of them and it's not consistent, with the story, that's a body language thing to look for. I'm going to throw out one different one. So there is, Doc, I'm going to need your help on this one. I believe it's called ITP, idiopathic thrombocytopenia. Purpura. Purpura. I knew there was another word in there. So, working on the pediatric floor, of course, so many people get nervous when the social worker walks in the room. But this kid was covered in bruises that didn't fit the story. What was the story? It was summer. He's a 10-year-old. He climbed to the top of the shed to see if he could jump down. And he jumped down from the top of the shed. Boys will be boys. But he was covered with multiple bruises and things that just didn't make sense. So, of course, they called in the child protection team while they ran the tests. I mean, nobody had done anything wrong. The child had a diagnosis that caused multiple stages of bruising and healing. It was okay. Folks who want their kids to be taken care of, you explain to them that you're following the rules, you're following the law, and that you're not accusing them of anything, but you are mandated to report certain situations. If somebody is going to harm themselves, harm somebody else, or causing harm, we have to report it. More questions?
Just wanted to throw out, I think we go to an increasing number of calls where you have maybe an elderly husband and an elderly wife living together.
Correct.
One of them is
Thank you.
really, really ill, requires a lot of care, and the other one is a poor caregiver. So the situation is maybe horrible, and the sick person wants to stay home and just live at home doing whatever the best they can, no matter how bad it might look. And so we might look at that and say, well, is that neglect, or is it two people just trying to do the best they can, but they're really having a hard time managing?
I'm glad you brought that up. Neglect is not always something you're doing on purpose.
I'm sorry.
Neglect is not always something that's done on purpose.
Oh, yeah.
It may be something that someone's doing their best. And unfortunately, sometimes your best isn't good enough. What Nikki just described, so there's Maryland being the state that we are, there are waiver programs because we want people to age in place. We want folks to be able to age at home. So you have folks who had a level of care that required them to be in a nursing home who are now getting government benefit and assistance with home nursing or an aide at home to help them with their activities of daily living, and they're home. And they've been helped to get from the nursing facility or the assisted living facility to their home. And the plan that was put in place was foolproof, but it wasn't people-proof. And there isn't a way for that elderly caregiver who just wants to, make good on the vows that they made to their loved one, that I'll take care of you till death do us part, and you want to age at home, I'll do everything I can, but I can't turn you. So now you've got bed sores. Or I can't clean you completely, so now you've got an E. coli UTI for the 7th time in 7 weeks. So it's not on purpose, but it happens. So the good news is through 211 Maryland, you would find that there is something called AIRS, Adult Evaluation and Referral Service, for the older adult population. And for the children, there's a voluntary program called Services to Families with Children. And these are 2 voluntary programs that are designed to go into the house, so they may not take an abuse or neglect report, but they may connect someone to voluntary services. Or you can offer them the voluntary services of Adult Evaluation and Referral Service. Each county has it. They'll go into the home, they'll do a home safety evaluation, and they will make a referral to appropriate available resources. They're voluntary versus adult protective services and child protective services, which are not. I strongly urge everyone to take advantage of the AIRS program for those vulnerable adults, because sometimes they don't know what services are available to them. They're simply doing the best they can. The Services to families with children is a kind of a hard sell to families, and I'll tell you why. Because they hear social services and they immediately think someone's trying to take their kid away. Versus what the reality is for the services to families with children is they're trying to find a way to keep your kid. Trying to find a way to connect you to resources that are already out there that you may just not be aware of. And that I'm not aware of that you need in the hospital because I can't go into your house. I'm in my ivory tower and have to count on folks on the street. I have 2 questions. Go ahead.
This is somebody's personal experience that they had on a call. It says, if I'm on scene at an MDC and I notice that car seats are not installed properly and children are not in the appropriate seats, do we need to report that as well?
That is an excellent question. So for those of you who didn't hear, the question is if somebody is on a scene of a motor vehicle accident or collision and they notice that children who should be in a car seat aren't, or a car seat that should be installed properly is not. That actually is a moving violation. Say it again. It's Tony. It's a criminal offense. It's a moving. It is an offense that is appropriate to refer to law enforcement. So you document that you noted it. If there's an MVC scene, document it, note it, and make sure you pointed it out to the law enforcement officer. 80% of car seats are not installed correctly. Those car seats are not installed correctly not because they didn't want to save their kid's life. They're not installed correctly because 80% of kids in a car seat. People are putting their kids in a car seat and not buckling them, or not buckling them properly. A reportable situation for an MVC would be child on the lap. Child not buckled, not secured. However, I suspect if there's an MVC and the child was not buckled or secured, there's going to be a larger issue, unfortunately, an injury related to the accident. Whenever we read about an ejection of a child, and we just had, unfortunately, a horrific accident where all 5 members of a family were killed, including children, by ejection. It's virtually impossible, and it's highly improbable for someone who is buckled to be ejected from a vehicle, fully ejected. Just saying.
How often, or does it happen that we may be called upon to be deposed or show up?
So the good news is we're the low men on the totem pole. We make the report. They're probably, unless we are very compelling witnesses and they've had experience with us in the past, they are not going to call on us, because there will be physicians and others by the time it gets to a court situation. You might be interviewed by a caseworker to find out what you heard or what you saw. It would be more rare that we would actually be the one on the stand. Yes?
And I think what you brought out is something that needs to make us a little more comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about neglect and abuse, but in fact, all we're reporting is behaviors or non-behaviors we have witnessed. Someone else will make the tag of, is it abuse?
Correct. We are reporting risk.
Yep. This is just what we saw. I thought you need to know. Someone else will make that decision. Who's licensed to do so.
Exactly. Thank you for bringing that up. What was said is that we are not the ones who are deciding if it's abuse or neglect. We are not the ones saying, grab the kid, take them away, never give them back. Grab the adult, never give them back. We are saying, we saw something. We were concerned enough to call you. I hope you'll follow up. Any more questions? Comments, concerns? I hope that each of you will take this information, and I can be contacted through the station, through Dr. Barinholtz. I can be contacted and be a resource for you. But each of you now have whether through the PowerPoint handouts or through the additional handouts, the resources to take this and go forward from there. Okay. Thank you guys for coming tonight. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
I got
Let me just give the mic.
So people are online are asking for the information that you provided in person. Do you have PDFs? Do you have
I do.
email stuff?
I'll
Send them to me and I can forward them.
Yep, absolutely. More on that.
Why is that?
Well, thank you.
As expected. Thanks. Can I borrow your pen? Is it black or is it purple?
No, it's purple.
Did you sign in already?
I did not. Here's a blank pen.
Oh, no. If somebody discloses to you, 100%. But if you see something in the grocery store, or you obligated to excuse me, can I get your name and number? Your treating it. Absolutely. If you're encountering them, you have to take it.
No. I'm done. Do you remember your number? So I can start breaking out?
Sorry, I can't close it until they're done
Yeah, no.
talking.
So that was easily then over 30 people. Pretty cool.
Yeah, a lot of people.
Pretty cool. 10 people online.
Yeah, we got up to 12.
Let's call it 12. Let's try the stuff that I need. This one.
You're over there, young guys.
Were you out on the engine?
No, I had a contractor in my house. I just got up here for the night.
We think, right? We think vulnerable adults, but